Today I'm going to tell you a story in this video, a true story. Years ago, I lived and worked in a large city on the prairies. And one day, after I came home from a day's work, I parked my car in the parking lot in the back of the house, locked the door, and slowly walked across the lawn towards the back door where the kitchen was. As I reached the back door, I heard a plaintive cry coming from across the street. It sounded like a little child weeping on the street. I went around the house, and as I stepped onto the sidewalk, I saw this little girl. She was running to and fro on the street, and her words through her tears found my ears. And she was saying, "I can't find my daddy. I can't find my daddy." There were a couple of teenage boys playing with their bicycles across the street, and they paid her no attention. I waited until she saw me. Then she stopped, and I started to walk towards her. As I got closer, she backed away, frightened, her little eyes large with fear and worry, tears streaking her little cheeks. She was no more than about 3.5 years old. The wind, being a fall day, was quite blustery, and it blew her hair across her face. She reached up and took the hair out of her eyes as she watched me coming towards her. As I got a little closer, she backed off again, and I thought, oh, I hope she doesn't dart away because she needs help. And I said to her, "Hello, don't be frightened. I will help you find your daddy," as I held my hand out to her. Suddenly she turned and darted away like a frightened deer, several paces. My heart just about stopped. Then she stopped and turned to face me again. And I said, "Don't be frightened. I'll help you find your daddy." And I kept walking slowly towards her. She waited for me there then, and as I got up close to her, she suddenly bolted, but it was towards me. And she grasped my hand and hung on as if she never wanted to let it go. And I then stooped down to her level, and I said, "If I help you find your daddy, I have to know where you live. Do you live around here?" And she shook her head. She didn't. She looked all around, and she didn't live around there. She shook her head. And I said, "You know, honey, can you tell me your name? I'll have to know your name." And then I was thinking also, should I take her into the house and call for help, or perhaps that would frighten her more, and I didn't want to do that. So I said to her, "If you tell me your name and if you can show me where you live, I'll help you find your daddy." And she looked right into my eyes and right down to my heart, and she said, "You help me find my daddy?" And I said, "Yes, honey, I will." Then she started to pull on my hand and forced me to stand up. And as we stood up, a couple came out of a house across the street. They paid us no attention, got into the car, their car, I suppose, and walked and drove away. As Mandy and I walked slowly down the street towards the corner. We got to the corner, and as we got there, I said to her, "Now, you look at all these houses, and you tell me if you recognize any that's where you and your daddy live." And she looked at all the houses, wiping the tears from her eyes to make sure she could see properly, and said no, she didn't know any of the places with her head. Well, I said to her, "Well, we'll have to do something. Maybe we should walk down the street a little ways." And she nodded to that. So I knelt on the sidewalk and took her in my arms, because I could see she was shivering. She was cold. The wind had blown her unzipped coat open. So I zipped up her coat and got her warmed up a little bit. And then I prayed, of course, that the Lord would lead us to her daddy. And I stood up and I said, let's go down the street a little ways here and see if we can find your house. So we did. We walked slowly down the street as she looked at all the houses, and I waited for her response to any of if she recognized any of them. As we walked, I was beginning to think we were going in the wrong direction. Suddenly she stopped and pointed at a house across the street, and she said, "They're my house, they're my house." And she looked at me with absolute joy in her eyes and on her face. And then she started to pull me across the street towards the house. Well, we got there, and I said to her, "Now, let's just wait, Mandy. I'll knock at the door, and we'll see." She waited quietly, looking up at me with, joy. And we heard someone coming towards the door. The door opened, and there stood this big, muscular man. His eyes looking at mine through the screen, as the screen door, were questioning. And I said, he didn't see Mandy right away. I said, "Do you know this little girl, sir? Is she your little girl?" And he looked down, and then he saw Mandy, and he said, and surprise came across his face, and he said, "Mandy, what are you doing here?" And she looked up at him with joy in her face, and still clinging to my hand. He opened the screen door, and he picked her up and held her close and said to me, she wandered away from home. She lives just over the other side on the other street, and I'll take her home. So then he put his cheek against hers and kissed her on the forehead and reassured her, "It's okay, Mandy, I'll take you home to your daddy." Then he remembered me and turned and said, "Thank you, friend." As they walked up the street, Mandy clinging tightly with her little arms around his neck, and joy just beaming from her face, I thought, how wonderful to have a friend to take you home to your daddy, to your father. Here was little Mandy, who was lost, who found a friend in me, and who led me to a friend of her father's, who was now taking her safely in his arms home to her father. The end of her journey, and the end of her frightening experience. I hope today she is well and happy, as I'm sure she is a lady today, somewhere. But I keep remembering her many times, because it taught me a lesson too. It taught me that we are all really Mandys and need our friend to take us home in his arms safely to the Father at the end of our journeys. Thank you for listening.